Okay, our next podcast picks up with the second in the topic of introduction to the study of life. So far we have kind of introduced what biology is, some of the different levels of study in biology, of organization in biological life, from atoms to molecules, all the way up to larger um, structures like organs, organ systems, individuals, populations, so forth. We talked a little bit about the importance of energy, genetics as a major theme in biology. Also, we looked at the major characteristics of all living things. So, a few more things to introduce as major themes in biology. One is the organization of the diversity of life on Earth. There is certainly a high level of diversity of life. Your text here states there's approximately 1.8 million species, which is a level of classification that we'll talk about in a minute, but about almost 2 million different species that exist, and new species are being discovered. And so it's estimated that there actually exists somewhere between 10, and estimates are between 10 and 100 million different species that exist. And so with that number of different species, there is certainly the problem of grouping these things and classifying them. So that's a major area, or a major goal of biology, is to group these things. And so biologists will do that. Before we look at the grouping system that we have, in the outline there, we mentioned some of the major kind of divisions of biology, and that would go into these different groups. Study of plants is botany, the study of animals, zoology. Herpetology is the study of reptiles. So we just mentioned a few examples in your outline there. And then we go into how we classify these things. So that is a field or a branch of biology called taxonomy. So taxonomy's goal is to classify these into different categories, these 1.8 million different individual organisms, into different groups. So the major system that we have today that we use is sometimes called the domain system, and that's because that's the highest category that we have. And so the domain would be the largest category, and as we work our way down, we get into smaller and smaller categories. So an analogy would be where you live. So you could say that you live in the United States, and that would be our largest category, the continent you live on. And then we work our way down into smaller categories, like you live in the Southeast United States. That would be your next category. And then the next category would be the state you live in, Georgia. And then the next category down would be what city, and then what county, and then what neighborhood, and then what street, and then what house, and then what room you live in the house, so forth. So we get more specific as we work our way down. So our classification system works the same way. So we have domains where every living thing would fall into one of these large, broad categories. There's three of them. And then under those we have other subcategories as we work our way down till we get very specific into grouping these individuals. Okay, so here's an example of the classification system where we are going to show you the groups that the American black bear belongs in. So first we look at that largest group, which in our analogy would be like our continent, the United States. So in this, the black bear would fall into the category with other bears, other mammals, also in the domain that includes birds and reptiles and plants and fungi and protists. That is a domain called Eukarya. And so all eukaryotic organisms would fall into this domain, including the black bear. And then we move down to the next classification level, and that's called the kingdom level. Now, in the kingdom level, we have 4 major kingdoms. We'll look at those in a minute, but we have, in an older classification group, kingdom used to be the highest level. Domain came along later, and so it's a more recent addition to the classification system that we use. We used to have a 5 kingdom classification system. Now we generally utilize the 3 domain classification system. But anyway, in the domain or in the kingdom Animalia, black bears fall into that with all other animals in that domain. And then the next category down is the phylum. In the phylum level, we have the phylum Chordata. This would include animals that have a backbone, like the black bear. And then we move to class as the next level down. Class includes the class Mammalia, which is the black bear falls into, along with other mammals. And then we go down to the within that class, there's a number of orders. The order that the black bear belongs in is Carnivora, with other carnivores included in there. And then the next level down is family, Ursidae. That includes these bears. And then in the genus Ursus, these bears right here. And then finally to the species level, would be the Ursus americanus, is the American black bear. So this is our classification system that we use for all living things, plants, animals, bacteria, protists, everything. We use this system of naming and grouping things. Now, as I mentioned, the domain, we have 3 domains. This is the domain Eukarya. The other domains are bacteria and archaea. So bacteria has its own domain, and archaea has its own domain. And then we have under the eukarya, as we mentioned, all of the animals, plants, fungi, and protists. So this is a large domain. Now, before we had the domain system, when we worked off of the 5 kingdom system, these 2 groups were grouped in as one kingdom called the kingdom Monera. So the bacteria and archaea, they are very similar organisms. They're both prokaryotic organisms. And so these were grouped in with one kingdom. And I will say that with this grouping and naming of things, there is subjectivity that is involved with grouping and naming things. Some biologists may recognize some differences between 2 individuals as just variation and think that those need to be grouped into the same category. And other biologists may look at those same 2 individuals and say they're strikingly different to them and need to be separated into 2 different categories. And that's why sometimes biologists are referred to as lumpers or splitters if they attempt to kind of group things together or separate things out. So that's our system, our 3 domain system that we use for grouping organisms in the field of taxonomy. Now, we mentioned some individuals named that help with development of these ideas of grouping and naming things. We mentioned John Ray. He really pioneered or began this field of grouping and naming. But Linnaeus, Carolus Linnaeus, is usually given credit as being the father of this field of taxonomy. And he really gave us our system that we use today of when we refer to something by its scientific name, we call it by its genus and species, those two lower levels in our classification groups. And so we still use that. We refer to that as the binomial two-name nomenclature, naming system. Binomial nomenclature is what we refer to when we call things by its genus and species. And sometimes we can abbreviate the genus with just its first letter. So one you'd be familiar with would be like Escherichia coli, but we abbreviate the genus Escherichia with E. So E. coli is the scientific name of that group. So John Ray and Carlos Linnaeus are two important figures for the development of our classification system. Okay, and this just mentions again that domain eukarya. The last thing we want to mention in our introductory topic here is the approaches that science takes in the study of life or the study of nature. And really, there's two types of approaches that can be taken in biology. One's called discovery science, and that would be like discovering those new species, like we talked about. And the other is hypothesis-based science, and this would be where you use a method called the scientific method to answer a question that you have. So in this, we mentioned in the outline that this method the scientific method can usually be stated in like 4 steps: observation, hypothesis, and then your experiment where you test that hypothesis, and then a conclusion. So 4 broad steps. So here's a simple example of examining a flashlight and seeing it doesn't work. And so you develop a question, which is your hypothesis that that you either have dead batteries or a bulb, and you test those, and then you figure out which one is supported, which one of those questions is supported by your experiment, which would be to either put a new bulb in or put new batteries in. So that's an example of that is the steps of the scientific method. Now, not everything in science can apply the scientific method. So some areas of science are still important, but we really can't test them per se in a method where we can go into the lab and do something. So there's still an area of science that this does not apply to, but it is an important area for a part of science. Okay, one last thing to mention here in our introduction to the study of life is Darwin. Darwin has a contribution to the field of biology in that he further developed an idea called natural selection. Now, natural selection is when organisms compete with each other for certain resources, and if you have the traits and therefore the genes associated with those traits to help you get those resources, you're better able to survive and pass your genes on to offspring. And if you don't, you're likely to die and take your genes with you. So this is always occurring in nature, is this survival of the fittest type thing, or descent with modification, a lot of different ways of stating it. But it's an important aspect when we look at nature and competition in nature. And so Darwin contributed to us. Now, Darwin also had some other ideas about evolution, and some of it went to historical evolution, things that are theorized to have occurred in the past. That's a different type of evolution. We can call that macroevolution, as opposed to microevolution, organisms competing for resources and passing their genes on. One's observed, the micro, and one is a theory about the past, macro. And so these are important themes in biology that we will get into. And that's where we end for this kind of introductory topic of the study of life. And we'll end there. And our next topic will be going into the chemistry of life that we'll look at in the next podcast.